Everybody, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, along with Manny Hill. Hopefully, you're enjoying this evening's football and listening to us. Although I saw that Lamar Jackson, just as I was getting set up here, got hurt, which is terrible because he was having a great year. And I feel like it's been every year that he's been dealing with injuries of late, and that's not great for the Baltimore Ravens. But I wanted to share a quick story with you, Manny, that you will appreciate before we dive into Josh Dobbs and Broncos and naming random Broncos and all the things that we're planning on doing here tonight on the show. So earlier today, I went out to TCO Performance Center and I sat down with our friends Will Ragetz and Andrew Kramer, and we recorded a podcast and we had a lot of fun, laughing, joking, football. Great time, great time. And I get home, I sit down on my laptop and I go to pull up the audio, and there's no audio. There's just a video of us talking, but no audio. Because what happened was I left the thing on mute the whole time. So we just sat in a room for no reason. And you can appreciate this as a producer, how much of a nightmare this is. And unfortunately, that was going to be tomorrow night's episode on YouTube and on the podcast feed. The truncated version is Will and Andrew think they're going to win in Denver, and you could figure out the rest, I guess. So I'm going to go live tomorrow night and answer fan questions on Friday night in place of the usual roundtable. But that is the nightmare scenario. So I apologize that there's no roundtable. Well, there was one. I mean, you can watch if anyone wants the video watching us talking, but you can't hear anything. So lip readers, that episode might be for you.
Yeah, wow, that's tough. And yeah, to your point, as a radio producer in my own right, I've been there. I've had situations like that where you record something or you think you have something and it's really good content, and then you listen back to it and the audio is like bad, or in this particular case, there is no audio at all. Yeah, that sucks, man. That's too bad if that happens. So I guess you have to make up for it by going live.
Yes, I will. I'll make it up to the audience who is breathlessly waiting for more Josh Dobbs analysis from us, which is what we're going to dive into first. And then we've got our 5 favorite Broncos of all time later on. Want to talk about Russell Wilson with you and your opinion there. And something that I saw that was really interesting, actually, a question someone posed to our friend Eric Eager on Twitter that I want to dive into with you as well. But let's go hardcore here a little bit, Manny. Do you think the Broncos are good now? Like, are you thinking? Usually at the end of the show, I'll ask Manny, "Do you think they'll win this game?" And you'll say yes or no. Why don't we just start with that? Do you think they're going to win this game against the Denver Broncos?
Um, I know a couple of weeks ago we were kind of looking at the schedule, and I had this pegged down as a loss. I I think, based on what we've seen from the Vikings the last couple of weeks, especially last week against the New Orleans Saints, particularly in that first half, it just kind of feels like this offense is starting to really find its groove now with Josh Dobbs. And Kevin O'Connell admitted after the game that he really kind of took the foot off the pedal in the second half. Because there was just, I don't think there was much of a belief that the Saints could really come all the way back from a 3 touchdown deficit to tie or win the game. So he really kind of eased up on the pedal there in the second half. But that first half was so good, and Josh Dobbs was playing about as well as you could ask for from a quarterback. And I think I'm starting to feel like that's going to continue. The Broncos defensively, they're ranked 32nd in the league in like so many different defensive categories, but I think a lot of that has to do with that big 70 spot that the Dolphins put on them early in the season, because they gave up over like 700 yards in that game. So I do think that the defensive statistics for the Broncos are a little bit inflated because of that one game, and they've played that unit's played a lot better in the last few weeks. And they forced the Bills into a lot of turnovers on Sunday night. But I think with the kind of groove that the Vikings are in offensively, I think they're going to find a way to go down and win. And I'm not sure I really buy into the Broncos being a good team again or as good as they were hoping to be when they first traded for Russell Wilson, 2 off seasons ago. So I think the Broncos are better than what they were last year. I think just by default because Nathaniel Hackett had no idea what he was doing, and I think Sean Payton kind of knows what he's doing at least at this stage of his career. So I think the Broncos are better than what they've been last year, but I still think the Vikings are in a position where they can go down and play really well.
So here's the last 4 weeks of opponents scoring against the Denver Broncos. They gave up 19 to Kansas City in a loss where their offense struggled. Then they gave up 17 to Green Bay in a win, 9 to Kansas City in a win, and 22 to Buffalo in a win that was hysterical and ridiculous. But still, I mean, that's only one game over 20 points in the last 4 weeks for them after being a complete disaster for most of the season. And even when you look at opposing teams' yardage against them, I mean, 369 yards for the Bills this last game, not a huge total. They got run all over in that game, but under 200 yards passing. Patrick Mahomes, I know he was dealing with an illness, but Kansas City only went for just over 200. Green Bay was under 200. And they have really turned it around in pretty impressive ways in the middle of the season. And it kind of speaks to when we evaluate strength of schedule. This is something that gets talked about endlessly in football. And I've always had a really tough time wrapping my own head around it because at the beginning of the season, we'll say, well, this team's got an easy schedule. And you're like, dude, halfway into the season, this thing will be blown up by 4 weeks from now. Your stats on strength of schedule will be blown up. And the same thing happens throughout the middle of a season where it's how you're playing. I mean, are the Vikings a difficult team to play? They're on their third quarterback, and yet somehow the answer is yes. And over the last 2 weeks, they have scored the 6th most points in the NFL. And you're absolutely right that Kevin O'Connell even admitted that he took the foot off the gas pedal and wondered aloud if he should have done that. But if they had put a little more, I think, pressure on the Saints offensively, been a little more aggressive, they could have scored even more. And even then, their point totals over the last 2 weeks have been very good and been emblematic of a top-notch offense, which is a tiny, tiny sample size. But it's also Atlanta and New Orleans are not these joke teams that are tanking. Like, dude, those are 2 teams that are fighting for their division. And now you go play another team that I think is pretty good. If you're going to talk about like why the Vikings could hit a stumbling block here, I think it is one that Denver is a much different version of what they've been before. The other thing is that Josh Dobbs has, in his very small sample size of playing in the NFL, he has had those ups and downs. He's had really good games. He's had some other games where he turns the ball over. And just in general, Manny, when a team wins 5 games in a row, you think that eventually they're just going to have something go wrong, right? And playing without Jordan Hicks, making that adjustment. I doubt Anthony Barr could take on a full workload if he's even going to play. It just seems like there's those factors weighing into it. Even if I think they should win, and even on paper, if I think they should win, I leave the door open to that because I'm taking the Broncos a lot more seriously than I would have 3 weeks ago when we had this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think when they had that 70-point game that they gave up against the Dolphins, I mean, everybody was kind of uh
Oh, Manny froze. Let's see if Manny comes back. Did I freeze? Let me know if
I'm
I
back.
froze in the comment section. Oh, now he's back. Now he's back.
I'm
You're
here.
back,
Got
Manny.
me? Okay.
You just froze for a second there. I don't know what happened, but you're back. So you were saying something about the Broncos. I forget what you were going to say. But start at the beginning of whatever you were saying.
Well, no, I think, the Broncos have certainly shown a lot of improvement, because they were kind of a laughing stock when the Dolphins hung 70 points on them. And everybody was making fun of them. And Sean Payton, ha ha ha, doesn't know what he's doing at this point. Why did they bring Vance Joseph back to be the defensive coordinator? All of this stuff. And the defense, I think, has gotten a lot better. The thing that I wonder though about the Broncos, and we'll kind of get into this with when we talk about Russell Wilson specifically. Offensively, it still seems like at times they still tend to struggle. They did put up 300 yards in Buffalo on Monday night, but you know when you look at some of the games that they've had recently, it hasn't been a lot of strong offensive production. The second game against Kansas City, when they did beat the Chiefs 24-9, they, like you said, Mahomes is dealing with that illness. Broncos only had 240 yards of offense in that game, and you still kind of wonder, like, when is, I mean, and Sean Payton being the offensive mind that he is, when are we going to see this Broncos offense really start to show a lot of improvement and get going and start looking the way that I think people were hoping that they would look even last year when Nathaniel Hackett was the head coach. So that's kind of something I'll be looking to watch for on Sunday, as well as, what Brian Flores is going to be able to dial up defensively against Russell Wilson, and can the Broncos kind of overcome some of the offensive struggles that they've had, even though overall as a team they've played better in recent weeks.
What I'm seeing on paper with Russell Wilson is that Sean Payton has decided that he's going to treat Russell Wilson like he is a kind of backup level quarterback. And what I mean is the short passing game and the play action and mostly leaning on the run. These last few weeks for Russell Wilson, it's been since week 4 since the man threw for 200 yards.
Yeah.
Like, what? I mean, that is not what you paid like 18 first round picks for Russell Wilson. But in the last few weeks, he's been fairly efficient, hasn't really turned the ball over. He's only got one turnover worthy play in the last 3 weeks and is graded out pretty well as a top half of the league quarterback. But they are not asking him to be the old version of Russell Wilson. I think Sean Payton probably got in and was like, all right, I'm going to show how stupid Nate Hackett was. Here I go. And then after the first few weeks went, oh, well, this guy basically can't do the things that he used to be able to do. So now we're going to focus on the run game, focus on the play action game. The thing about the Vikings is over these last 5 weeks, of course, we're going to talk about Josh Dobbs, and that deserves to be the center story of the NFL. It's a quarterback. It's always more exciting. The run defense, again, like not making front page news on ESPN, but the run defense has been one of the best in the entire league. They have moved themselves up, despite that Philly game early in the year, into the top 5 in terms of yards per attempt. And that gives them a chance in any game that opposing teams cannot just play it safe and hand the ball off. Like, they're forcing quarterbacks to beat them. And over these 5 weeks, none of those quarterbacks have been able to do it. Even against San Francisco, they were really excellent, and they held, Christian McCaffrey under 4 yards per carry. Very, very hard to do. In Green Bay, they've got a couple of good running backs, or at least in the past, they've had times where they were good. They couldn't run the football at all. Alvin Kamara's got a great history. He couldn't run the ball at all for the Saints. And when that's the case, it gives you a really good shot. And you're going to ask now Russell Wilson, I think, to try to stand in there and diagnose everything that's going on, if they can continue to do that without Jordan Hicks. But that is my big concern for this game is, yeah, the Vikings have really gotten back on the right side of turnover luck big time in the last 5 weeks. We knew that was going to have to happen in order for them to go on a winning streak. But I think Jordan Hicks has played as well as any linebacker in the league during that time, especially considering all the things that he has to communicate to his teammates. Him being out, and unfortunately on just some kind of random play where his leg hits somebody else, now you're asking an undrafted free agent, Ivan Pace, who's been very good, to handle a lot, though, and probably play the entire game unless you're getting Anthony Barr in there. But with the communication and the headset thing, you can't really like change the helmet to other people. You can't just, okay, Harrison Smith, take Pace's helmet. Like, that's just a really hard thing to do on the fly. So that to me is where these things kind of line up. And, Thor is bringing up, it's been an emotional last couple of weeks. It feels like a trap game. I do feel that way, but I also feel like on paper, when I look at how they've performed, that I still think they're a stronger team than Denver. So I'm really conflicted going into this one.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, it's tough. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, I had the Vikings losing this game just because, for that very reason, that, well, the Broncos are playing a little bit better, and it's a tough place to play, the altitude, all of that stuff. It's a kind of a weird game at a weird time. But I just feel like it feels like the Vikings, especially on the offensive side and defensively too, but offensively, it feels like they've really got themselves into a groove now, and Josh Dobbs is really settled in with the system and the scheme. And I think if they can just limit the turnovers and put up enough points, and not put the defense into tough situations. I mean, I think that's going to be the most important thing for Josh Dobbs is, you can't have the safety that you had in Atlanta. You can't have the lost fumbles and that sort of thing, because it does feel like the Broncos, I mean, look no further than Monday night in Buffalo. The Broncos are kind of an opportunistic team where they'll, if you give them a little bit of life, they're going to take advantage of it, even though, they've had their ups and downs this year too. So I think the most important thing is going to be just avoid that costly turnover, inside your own 30-yard line that gives the Broncos some confidence and puts them in a position where the offense doesn't have to move a lot of yards to put points on the board. If they can avoid stuff like that, then I like the Vikings' chances.
Yeah, and Dobbs and his turnover history are the one thing that concerns you a little bit, because they do have playmakers on the other side. I mean, turnovers are random. There's no question about it at times, but also when you have players that are capable of making plays, Patrick Surtain is one of them at the top of the list that you have to be concerned about. I saw something that Sean Payton said that I wanted to bring up, because for the most part, we've been talking about this team as if they were not going to have Justin Jefferson for a little while longer. And so when we go into these games, we're like, well, okay, Hawkinson's going to have to keep going, and Addison, and we'll see these matchups. And we just haven't really even brought up Justin Jefferson much, even though his window is open to return. And Sean Payton said that they're preparing as if Justin Jefferson's going to play. Now, I don't think that Sean Payton has moles inside the Vikings organization or whatever. I mean, maybe he does. Like George Payton was here, and there were other people who were in that building that went and worked for the Broncos. George Payton's the Broncos GM. If he used to work with the Vikings as their assistant GM, if people don't know that. And so maybe he's got some intel. Maybe he left some video equipment behind to spy on their practice. I don't know. It's not the Patriots, so probably not. But I just have been under the impression that Justin Jefferson is going to come back maybe after the bye week, that they want him to be 100%. But I also had this thought, as Sean Payton was saying it, like, well, they're not going to tell us which week they're going to put him out there, right? Like, they want it to be a surprise. Here's Jefferson. And so I guess I really do wonder if we're going to see him this week. I think the answer is still no. And it's maybe a good little cat and mouse for Kevin O'Connell to not give out any hints about when he's coming back, so he can have an element of surprise for the opponent, even if they are preparing for Jefferson. But when that happens, then we get to really feel what it's like to have Josh Dobbs as your quarterback. We've seen over history, backup quarterbacks, journeymen, guys who show up, can have these short stints. Sometimes they sustain, sometimes they don't. But what I've wanted to see since he got here and since he, beat Atlanta is, all right, what's this really going to look like when they have their full pen of players that we expect them to have, not just for the short term, how dangerous they could be, but also for the long term. What do you think? What do you think about the idea of Jefferson potentially coming back?
Well, I mean, it would be interesting if he came back this week. Obviously, I think it would increase the Vikings' chances. But you also have to think about, like, okay, how close to 100% is he? We talked about in a recent episode, we talked about how important it is going to be for him to wait till he's 100% before he steps back onto the field. Hamstrings are very tricky. You come out too soon, you come back too soon, and you might tweak that thing again, and then all of a sudden you run the risk of maybe tearing it or re-pulling it, and now all of a sudden you're out for 5 or 6 more weeks, possibly the rest of the season at that point. So you want to get him back at 100%. But yeah, I think he would just add an extra dynamic element to what we have seen as a really productive offense in his absence, specifically with Josh Dobbs. And I think with Dobbs's ability to escape and extend plays as well, I think can really be, enhanced if Justin Jefferson's in the lineup, because Justin Jefferson is so instinctive as well. He's such a pro's pro. He runs great routes, obviously. We know all of those things, but asking a team to have to cover him for an extended period of time because the quarterback is getting outside of the pocket and expanding a play, it's just going to make him even more dangerous because that's a lot to ask of a secondary to try and it's a lot to ask of a secondary to guard him at any time, but to guard him on a extended play because the quarterback has the ability to get outside and make it harder in that way is just going to add an extra element to this offense. So I'm excited to see it. Hopefully JJ can get back soon, and we can really see what Josh Dobbs can do in this offense with a full healthy unit.
Something that keeps coming into my mind and my mentions as well and my mailbags as well, and I'm not really sure how to quite answer it, is whether the Vikings actually have a better offense with Josh Dobbs. I mean, the scoring output for 2 games has been better, but I mean, we just know how little of a sample size 2 games is. Like, there have been 2 games where Kirk Cousins has crazy great numbers. There's been 2 game samples where everybody wants Kirk Cousins sent in a rocket ship to the moon, because he's been so frustrating to watch. And like, look, Carolina and Chicago, there was no reason to think Kirk Cousins was going to turn it around. And then the guy comes out and plays 2 unbelievable games against the 49ers and the Packers. Like, who knows, right? So there could always be something different coming around the corner for us. And yet, as what you were just talking about, it's not just that he runs, but it's also that when you have like these other receiving weapons who can play off of that. And TJ Hawkinson was talking about it today. It was actually really fun to listen to. He was talking about how when he's out there on a route and he looks back at Josh Dobbs and he's on the move, he has a good sense for, is his eyes staying down the field like he's going to, go for a pass, or is he, looking like, I need you to kind of go block somebody or whatever. They already have this kind of chemistry. And I also ran across a stat that no quarterback has been more valuable by expected points added on the ground than Josh Dobbs this year. Like, there's something here of that running element that matters when it comes to producing points. It might not matter when it comes to yards per pass attempt as much, or quarterback rating, although his has been good through these 2 games, or whatever other statistic. And yet it's like this sort of hidden success that happens when this guy runs that gives you a chance potentially to score more points. But I also am trying hard to fight the forces of overreaction, which is almost impossible in a situation such as this one.
Yeah, I'm struggling with the same thing because I keep thinking like, well, that clunker is going to happen at some point. Is it going to happen this Sunday? I don't know, but you just kind of look ahead at the schedule. You still got a couple of more, really games that you look at on paper and say, okay, yeah, we can see them winning those games. Then you get into a tough stretch with Cincinnati potentially and 2 games against Detroit. But yeah, you feel like that clunker is coming, but then you look at what we've seen so far, and it's like, well, he's not really giving any sort of indication that clunker is coming. We're just kind of assuming that it's going to come because law of averages, every team has a bad game. I mean, Kirk Cousins largely has played well this year before he got hurt, but he had, a game in Carolina where he did not play very well at all. The Vikings still won the game, but Kirk didn't play well at all in that game. He largely has played pretty well in the other games this season. So everybody is susceptible to having a bad game. With Josh Dobbs, though, it's just hard to figure out, like, when is that going to be? And then if and when it does happen, is that just a blip on the radar, or is it something that is going to continue? And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, because even though he's looked really good in these last 2 games, we still don't really fully know exactly what this is going to be looking like come, week 18, when the Vikings are possibly in a position to try and get into the playoffs.
What's going to happen is he's going to have his random bad game when Jefferson returns, and he's going to want him traded. That's what's going to happen. As it'll be like Dobbs has that 2 fumble, 2 interception game. They lose, and it's the first game Jefferson comes back, and then I'll get all the like, they're 1 in whatever with Jefferson. They should probably get rid of him and trade him for draft picks. Like, what is going on right now? Joe Burrow is going to the locker room with a right wrist injury. What is happening in this football game? This was supposed to be like a game of the year. I'm sorry to scream that out in the middle of Vikings talk, but what is going on with both great quarterbacks being injured? Pittsburgh's going to easily make the playoffs because everybody else is literally every other quarterback in that division is injured.
Collar, it's the damn Thursday night football. Even when we get a good matchup like tonight, the Bengals and the Ravens, we get a situation where both quarterbacks, both stud, outstanding, amazing quarterbacks get injured in the game. This is why I hate Thursday night football. This is why I hate it. I can't stand it. You can never have nice things.
No, they should have just put Titans and Jaguars on tonight and just avoided the whole thing together. Oh man, this is brutal. Okay, so got a quick ad read, and then I have a very interesting. Wow, is Jake Browning going into the game? Former Vikings quarterback. That's something. But I have a really interesting question that somebody asked our friend Eric Eager on Twitter that I want to run by you. But first, I want to remind everyone that a couple weeks from now, I am headed to Las Vegas for the football game there. And if you want to escape the Minnesota December weather like I will be doing, you can join me at Circa in Las Vegas. I'll be hanging out there doing the podcast for a couple days leading up to the game. You can find me outside at Stadium Swim watching the gigantic TV that they have. And there's no good way to describe, if you haven't seen it, how big this is. It's an actual like football field size television with nothing but sports on it, which is my dream. They've got heated pools there, even if it's on the cooler side in the 70s when we go out to Vegas. One of the best places on earth. And there is a special party for Minnesota sports fans, including drink specials and a ticket giveaway that Friday night at Circa. So come meet me there. Go to circalasvegas.com. You have to RSVP. So go to where it says huddle up at the overhang bar, which is what's inside Circa, where this party will be, and make a whole weekend of it at Circa. That's what I'm going to do. It is located on the amazing Fremont Street. We're going to have a great Minnesota December getaway to Vegas at Circa. It'll be lots of fun. So book your spot today, and I will see you there. So here is the question that was posed to our pal Eric Eager on Twitter. Someone asked who would be favored on a neutral site, or I guess it could just be Minnesota, the 2022 Minnesota Vikings with Cousins, or the 2023 Minnesota Vikings, assuming that they're healthy. So you get Jefferson for both teams. With Josh Dobbs at quarterback. So 2022 Vikings versus 2023 Vikings. Which team would be favored to win that game if they were to play each other?
Which team would be favored? Huh.
You could just do it of like who do you think would win? Who do you think would win between last year's Vikings and this year's Vikings?
Okay. I actually think the 2023 team would win. And here's why. I think certainly you have a defense that may be lesser in talent from the 2022 team, but the defense is playing much better. And I think it has to do with scheme, obviously with what Brian Flores is doing. And also to that point, if you factor in Josh Dobbs being able to throw against the Ed Donatel defense of 2022, I think he would be very successful. Because I don't know if Ed Donatel would be knowing what he was doing out there. So I would take the 2023 Vikings to beat the 2022 Vikings, even though, you know, that team last year won 13 games and won the division. There were just so many games that they won based on just circumstance and, you know, having a clutch play by Kirk Cousins down the stretch, or a big catch by Justin Jefferson. You know, that was also a team that got, you know, when they went up against a really good quality opponent, they didn't just lose. They got obliterated by the Eagles last year. They got obliterated at home by Dallas last year as well. And so I think when you factor that in, the game late in the season at Lambeau against a not very good Packers team where they just kind of laid an egg too. When that team lost last year, it just did not look good at all. Whereas this year, you know, a lot of those, they've lost a lot of close games, but they have yet to really maybe that Eagles game, you know, for about 3 quarters, they got manhandled pretty well, but they still were able to kind of get back into that game and make it interesting at the end. So I think just with the way the 2023 team has played this year, even though the record isn't as good, I think if you match up the two teams together, I think this year's team wins.
Tim Bro Slice says, does the 2022 Vikings team get the luck from last year? You know what a big part of the luck was, though, was last year's schedule was not hard for the Vikings. I mean, this year, the beginning of the season schedule, I mean, we talked about it at the beginning of the year where it's at Philly, it's playing the Chiefs, it's playing the 49ers, and we know that by the way, it is Jake Browning in the game, former Vikings quarterback, now playing for Cincinnati. Just what everybody wanted on Thursday Night Football. But good luck to him. He's a really, really good dude. So I hope that works out for him against a great defense. Anyway, put that back aside. So I think that like last year, that was a major part of the story that wasn't really talked about a ton was when you looked at a lot of their wins. And I know one was in Buffalo. It was magical. It was incredible. But aside from that, it was Taylor Heineke throwing an interception at the end of a game, Skylar Thompson, then Teddy Bridgewater in a week where he had a concussion before, and they were without their left tackle, I think. And, there were several other games where they were playing teams that just weren't that special. Arizona was horrible. Chicago was horrible. So this year, I do think that they have put on better showings against average teams and played more competitively. Like they have the huge win against the 49ers. And I would call last week a pretty big win as well. The running element is massive because Daniel Jones ran all over them. And that would be the comparison. It's like if Daniel Jones could run all over them and pass all over them, then Josh Dobbs could too. And if, Garrett Wilson made them look ridiculous last year and a number of other receivers, then Justin Jefferson would make them look ridiculous as well. And the defensive side of it is just such a huge part of this conversation that I think that especially with the way that Danielle Hunter is playing, the way the Vikings offense struggled to identify last year blitzes, which they've done way, way better this year, that I think Brian Flores is having a field day with last year's version of the offensive line. And it can't be left out of the discussion of how much better the line is and how much better the defense is. I do think this is a stronger team. And that's only with the asterisk if Josh Dobbs doesn't turn into a pumpkin. Because if Josh Dobbs suddenly becomes the version that was happening the last few weeks in Arizona, well, then, that conversation goes out of the window. But I do think this team is better than they were last year. And the point differential at this point would also tell you that as well.
Yeah. I mean, and it's crazy to think about this year's team was 0-3 and they were 1-4. And we were talking about them selling off players and going into full-on tank mode before the trade deadline. We were speculating about that. And now here we are, like looking at the way they've played over the last month. And it's like, yeah, this is a pretty good team that is not really showing any signs of slowing down. Now, we'll see what happens on Sunday, but right now it's hard to really it's hard to ignore just how well overall they've been playing as a team. Even before Kirk Cousins got hurt, and then since Josh Dobbs stepped into that quarterback role, it's hard to believe, but they look good defensively. They've been really strong and seem to be getting a lot better as those guys get settled in to Brian Flores' system. And so much of last year, and last year was fun. Don't get me wrong. Last year's team was fun. The way they were winning games, it was kind of crazy, but I think that team just when you really kind of take the sort of the excitement, the fandom out of it, watching last year's team, you kind of realize they weren't really a 13-win team. They won 13 games, but they were probably more like a 9, maybe a 10-win team at best. And when you look at this year's team, they look to be kind of trending to be kind of a 9, maybe a 10-win team as well. And they're playing better. They're playing better on the defensive side of the ball too. So I think, when you kind of take all of those things into consideration, it's you start to realize that, yeah, this is a better team than last year's squad.
And we will see how this opinion holds up over the coming weeks,
Right.
because that's how we feel right now. And we're going to get more information as we go forward. I want to circle back and talk about Russell Wilson specifically. He is playing in a version of Russell Wilson that looks nothing like what he looked like in his prime. He was one throw away, several inches away from being a two-time Super Bowl champion, and also had several other years that his team went into the playoffs as having potential to go deep and was a Super Bowl caliber team. A great quarterback who's had a great career. My question is about Russell Wilson, because I don't think this is ever going to be way better. So we kind of know like what Russell Wilson's career is, even when we're watching the later stages, unless he totally surprises me and starts throwing for 350 yards again, but I doubt it. Is he a Hall of Famer to you?
Ooh, I'm gonna say yes. Although they always, I've heard a lot of people say, well, if you have to think about it, then maybe the answer is probably no. But I'm gonna say yes because I think there was enough of, um, the nine first 9 years of Russ's career, he was just, I mean, you just look at the win-loss record and the numbers and just how good those Seattle teams were, even after the those couple of years after the Legion of Boom kind of disbanded and kind of fell apart, and it really kind of became Russell Wilson's team. He was still really good, and they were winning still and going to the playoffs and very competitive. So it's hard to really ignore that. I guess I kind of look at it as, just switching sports a little bit. I think about it like Joe Mauer's career with the Minnesota Twins, where you look at Joe Mauer as a catcher, he was great, like best catcher in Major League Baseball. And you look at the numbers offensively as a hitter and the Gold Gloves defensively. He was one of the great catchers of all time. But then you factor in, okay, when he moves to first base, the offensive numbers aren't quite as good. First base is not as premium a defensive position, so it doesn't get held as in high regard. Although I would argue Mauer was a pretty good defensive first baseman as well. Should have won a Gold Glove one of those years too, but he got robbed, by the way. But I think you kind of look at those careers as kind of the same, where the first decade of that career is just fantastic and Hall of Fame worthy. But then you kind of wonder, like, are the last 4 or 5, 6 years going to be held against him when it comes down to voting? I think he will get in. I think if he can find a way to get like one more like winning season where the Broncos make the playoffs and maybe make a little bit of noise, however it gets done, even if he doesn't look amazing doing it, I think that will help his cause. And, I think he'll eventually find a way to get into Canton. The first 10 years of his career looks like he was going to be first ballot to me, but it might be a situation where he'll get in eventually, but it might take a few years before that time actually comes after he retires.
So I've got the Pro Football Reference Hall of Fame monitor up here, which does a very good job of combining a player's statistics and accomplishments together. Because I mean, still, let's be honest, those Hall of Fame voters are going to factor a Super Bowl, as much as you might not like it, because Dan Marino didn't win one. But if you're a fringy quarterback for the Hall of Fame and you have a Super Bowl, it's going to enhance your case. And I'll give you where he stands in relation to the other quarterbacks of kind of the era-ish. Some he came in a little later, but the era-ish. Clearly behind these guys, Brady, Manning, Rodgers, Breeze. Matt Ryan is surprisingly high on this list from the Hall of Fame monitor. I think he's another one people debate, but according to this, at least, he shouldn't be much of a debate. That's a little surprising to me. Ben Roethlisberger, Phillip Rivers, those are the guys who are clearly ahead of Russell Wilson. In his ballpark is Eli Manning, Matthew Stafford, Cam Newton, and those are kind of, and then it's like a pretty big drop off to the next most recent quarterback. So if he's in the ballpark, according to the Hall of Fame monitor, which is not gospel, of course, but is just one metric way to kind of figure out where it stands, if he's in the same range as a Matthew Stafford and Cam Newton, that to me puts him a little bit on the fringe without another, as you said, like trip to the AFC Championship or trip to the Super Bowl or just Pro Bowl caliber season. If he's just grinding out like bad seasons where he's going to throw for 3,400 yards and, what I saw Adam Schefter tweeting like, oh, he's so much different this year, like getting 16 touchdowns. Like, wait, is 16 touchdowns a lot, man? Like, I don't think so. Maybe if it was 1996 by this point of having 16 touchdowns would be pretty good. But I think what's similar of all those quarterbacks is that at one point you could make an argument that they are upper echelon. But those other ones we were talking about, Matt Ryan, and then above that, Phillip Rivers and Ben Roethlisberger, and then of course the Brady Manning tier and the Rodgers, it just goes on for longer, their peak, and there isn't as much of a dip as he had. I think that those are fair, comparable quarterbacks of Stafford, and Cam Newton, and I don't think either one of those guys belong in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I wonder if the Matt Ryan thing. I wonder if his MVP that he won in 2016 is maybe a little bit of, because Russ has never won an MVP. He's been in the conversation before, but he's never actually won one. And I wonder if like Matt Ryan winning that MVP in 2016 is kind of like what kind of puts him over Russell Wilson in that regard, because you look at, I mean, Matt Ryan's made one Super Bowl appearance, Russell Wilson's actually made two. And so, the numbers are kind of similar production wise during that really good stretch for Russ. So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting conversation. I think if I'll say yes that he does get in, but like I said before, if he does, I think it's going to be one of those things where he's going to be eligible for probably 3, 4, 5 years before I think we start getting some traction on him getting in. I think it's going to take a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And when you look at, just to go even deeper into the statistical weeds, when you look at his weighted career approximate value by Pro Football Reference, he's much closer to Roethlisberger, which I think is probably, I do think he's maybe a little bit ahead of Matt Stafford and Cam Newton. If you were ranking those three, I would probably put Wilson first. But what might hurt him is when they won the Super Bowl, it was so much centric around their defense and the Legion of Boom and so forth. And these are the nuances that kind of end up determining what we think about these discussions. I don't think there's some, I mean, Eli Manning may end up doing it as well for those Super Bowls, but also the early Manning's a great comparable for Wilson, because the first half of Manning's career is, I will argue all day long, it's a great first half of his career. But what happened was the league changed midway through his career. So those statistics that he's putting up in 05, 06, 07, like those look terrible by today's standards, because that was 20 years ago. And by those standards, he was routinely statistically among the best quarterbacks, but it was just a different league at that point as far as passing the football. Anyway, staying with a little bit of the Bronco theme, when the Vikings play a random team that has a great history, we got to talk about our favorite historical players. And every once in a while, I see that tweet come up that's like, hey, football fans could just sit around and talk about random players all day. And I'm like, hell yeah, we can. So let's do that. I asked you to make your list, a simple one, of your 5 favorite Denver Broncos of your lifetime, Manny. So let's fire it up. Who are your 5 favorite Denver Broncos?
Okay, so counting down from 5 to 1, and this was actually really hard because when you look at the Broncos' history, especially like in the 90s when Mike Shanahan became the head coach, and they had the great zone running scheme and so many running backs. I mean, Terrell Davis obviously was the best one out of the bunch, but so many other just random running backs being so productive in random seasons. So I went the route of a guy who didn't play much with the Broncos. He was with the Broncos for a while and was an assistant coach. I'm going to go number 5 is Gary Kubiak, and I'm going to tell you why.
Wow, great pick.
One, because Gary Kubiak was, like we've talked about, was just the godfather of the zone running scheme. And I figure, if I'm gonna pick like, oh, I'll pick Alandis Gary because he had a really fun season with the Broncos, or I'll pick Mike Anderson, Clinton Portis, all these guys. And I'm thinking, well, I can't bunch all of those guys together. So why don't I just take the guy who was really responsible for those guys being productive running backs during the late 90s and into the early 2000s? So Gary Kubiak is number 5. And, he was John Elway's backup for a number of years back in the 80s and into the early 90s, and eventually became an assistant coach under Mike Shanahan, and then later on, obviously, won the Super Bowl as the head coach of the Broncos in 2015. So Gary Kubiak is number 5. Number 4 is a guy who was, I think, really well liked around the league and really well respected, and really got to showcase his talent once Peyton Manning started throwing him the football and it wasn't Tim Tebow anymore. And that's the late Demaryius Thomas, who was really, really, really good, really productive. You look at those years where Peyton Manning was his quarterback, and you look at those numbers, they are outrageous. He's like one of the best wide receivers in the entire NFL, and a big guy, big physical guy, but could also run like a deer as well. A really good wide receiver, and tragically his life was cut short just a couple of years ago at such a young age. But Demaryius Thomas is my number 4.
Love that. Yeah, I like that you're going a little bit different here. Of course, you mentioned Gary Kubiak. You're going to get no pushback from me. I mean, I love that style of offense, and that style of offense, which starts with Shanahan and even goes back to the San Francisco days and so forth. But they really perfected it. I mean, he just had such an ability to make the most of everybody. I mean, Brian Greasy had a great year there. Jake Plummer had a great year. Like his legacy with the Broncos, is really something. And as far as Demaryius Thomas goes, probably one of the most underappreciated players. Like sometimes when a great player ends up getting paired with an all-time great quarterback, we just go like, well, of course you should have all those yards and so forth. And I like that you also stretched beyond just that 90s era as well into that section of Broncos history. So who is your top 3?
Number 3 is a guy that might kind of surprise you that he's on this list. I'm going to go with nose tackle Greg Cragen. And here's why. For only one reason. That guy, if I challenge all the listeners and the viewers of this podcast, go look up the Super Bowl highlight video of Super Bowl 24, where the poor Denver Broncos are just getting annihilated by Joe Montana and Jerry Rice and the San Francisco 49ers. 55-10 was the final in the Superdome. And Greg Cragen was mic'd up as the Broncos nose tackle. He's mic'd up for this game. And there's a stretch in the second quarter where Montana's just throwing darts all over the Broncos defense. And poor Greg Cragen is just battling. He's in the trenches, man, going toe to toe with this great 49ers offensive line. And he's breathing hard. And he's just, Montana throws a 20-yard pass at Jerry Rice, and you hear Greg Cragen just go, "What's happening, man? What's going on? Like, come on, guys, we got to keep going. He's on the sideline saying, come on, we got to keep going. We got to keep fighting. This game's not over yet. We got a whole second half to play. We got to keep fighting." And I just always appreciated that guy was just out there battling and playing his ass off, and in a blowout game where the team as a whole was just completely overmatched. And Greg Cragen was a pretty good player in the late 90s, in the late 80s into the early 90s. He was a Pro Bowler and All-Pro nose tackle for a Broncos defense that was pretty good. That included guys like Steve Atwater and whatnot too. So Greg Cragen is number 3 on my list.
You kind of went rogue a little bit there with that pick, but it's funny because when you said Broncos nose tackle, I was like, Keith Traylor. Like I thought you were gonna, because
I
Keith
thought about him.
Traylor, and I think he did it for Chicago, but had one of the coolest interceptions of all time, where he ran it back for a touchdown. And there was another option too, which was Ted Washington. Also, was another guy who played nose tackle for them, which was very likable. And there's a lot of great defensive linemen in their history who deserve to be on a list. All right, top 2.
Number 2 is Ed McCaffrey. Ed McCaffrey was fantastic, and part of the reason why I have him on this list too is because he's on one of my favorite teams of all time, the 94 49ers. Didn't play a lot for that team that won the Super Bowl, but he then went on to when Mike Shanahan, who was the offensive coordinator of that 49ers team in 94, went on after that season to become the head coach of the Broncos. Ed McCaffrey went with him, and then he ended up being a really good, productive wide receiver for the Broncos for a number of years. And obviously, his son Christian is one of the most dynamic players in the NFL today. And so Ed McCaffrey is number two, a really, really good wide receiver for the Broncos in the late 90s.
And now your number one options are all over the place. You've
Yes.
got a lot of players that you left off of your list so far. Who are you putting on it?
I'm going to put my guy, Shannon Sharp. Uncle Shannon, Shay Shay. I'm going to have him number one on my list. The guy was he was a great Hall of Fame caliber tight end. Obviously got into the Hall of Fame, won 3 Super Bowls, 2 with the Broncos and 1 in Baltimore. And still in a weird way, Coller, I still feel like he doesn't really get appreciated enough still for as great as he was. But we've seen so many, great tight ends come into the league, since he retired, that I think sometimes he gets forgotten a little bit, which is hard to think because he's all over the media now doing stuff for ESPN and First Take and all that stuff. So we see Shannon Sharp everywhere, but I don't know if younger people really appreciate how great of a tight end he was. And when you factor in the era that he played in, you go and look at his numbers are pretty good. They don't really blow you away, but you also have to remember the time in which he played, where tight ends didn't really rack up a lot of pass catching numbers in the 90s. If you plug him into today's NFL, that guy is kicking all sorts of ass in the NFL in today's league. So Shannon Sharp, number one, all-time trash talker as well. Just a great player. There's that famous clip of him on the sideline. The Broncos are in Foxborough blowing out the Patriots, and he's saying, "Call the National Guard, call the ambulance, call all these people because we are killing the Patriots right now." So Shannon Sharp, all-time great tight end, great player, great personality as well, is number one on my list.
And Shannon Sharp, if anybody ever gets a chance to do so, go check out his Hall of Fame speech, because the TV personality that you think that with Shannon Sharp, who's over the top and funny and everything else, watch this speech. It's incredible. To me, it's the best speech ever given that I've ever seen in the Hall of Fame. And, when he they're giving you a hard time in the comments. No, Manny
Yeah.
did see John Elway play. This is favorite list, not the best of
Yes.
all time. It's the favorites. This
And
is your
and
pick.
by the way, I was in Canton in 2004 to watch John Elway get inducted into the Hall of Fame. I was there in person with a bunch of Broncos fans. We were there for Carl Eller, my stepdad's former teammate. But John Elway, Barry Sanders all got in at the same time. So I know who John Elway is. He was amazing. I know.
But yeah, I mean, if we're just going favorites, your list is very unique. And I tried to be a little bit, but maybe I went a little more mainstream. But you're right about Shannon Sharp. When he was at the end, toward the end of his career, he was being talked about on broadcast as the greatest tight end ever play. And I think it's actually easy to forget that sometimes when someone does become a broadcaster, is that is their current how people think of them, and they lose a little bit of that. It's like when you watch, I don't know, Terry Bradshaw or Jimmy Johnson year in and year out. You're like, actually, this guy, even though as goofy as his takes may seem right now, was one of the greatest coaches of all time. And maybe that's not always reflective in 30-second hot spewing takes on television. For me, I also went a little bit off the board with my number 5 pick, and that is Jason Elam, their kicker. And I'll tell you why.
Like it.
Because I was watching the game when he kicked the 61-yard field goal. And at the time, that was one of the coolest things I've ever seen in my life. I mean, I know it's in Denver, or maybe it was actually on the road. He actually may have been on the road. It was a bomb. And yeah, kickers do that all the time now, but they didn't then, like when he was at his peak as their kicker. So I always thought that he was like their secret weapon, kind of. If they were at the 35-yard line, it was kind of like having Jason Tucker, that Jason Elam could come out and was one of the best kickers. So that's my off the wall pick a little bit. Number 4 for me, I'll just give you a salute. Terrell Davis, man, we can't leave Terrell Davis off of this list. But I also really enjoyed when Gary Kubiak would talk about Terrell Davis and how great he was. When Gary was a member of the Vikings, that was cool. He'd be like, "Well, we had this guy Terrell Davis, kind of remind me of Delvin Cook." It was pretty cool. But Terrell Davis was just so fast, so powerful, so perfect for that fit of that offense that I had to include him on my list. Again, I'm going down the fairway here from number 3, Steve Atwater.
Yeah.
Another one of the coolest players ever, one of the hardest hitters, would be arrested, put in jail. They'd throw away the key if he was playing today. I understand that. I'm sure he would have had to adjust his game, but he got known so much for the hard hitting that maybe some of the other parts were left out of his game. But he was a dynamic player. He could come to the line of scrimmage. He could make plays on the football. One of the best all-around players. And just the aesthetic, just the vibe of Steve Atwater was so intimidating. I think that he had one of those like bigger than just the game. Now, I did include John Elway because, Manny, I enjoyed the heck out of John Elway. That he had these like almost 3 careers where it was like the very early John Elway, where he's this diva that is always going to be known for forcing his way not to be drafted by Baltimore, to the Super Bowl losses where it's Elway's not clutch. He can't win the big game. And then to this transition point with Wade Phillips, where there's some down years and they're just not that great of a team, to then Mike Shanahan coming in. But there was nobody, and still probably not, that's ever played other than Brady, maybe Mahomes, where you go, it's not over. No matter what happens, no matter what the score is, no matter how far they have to go, every game is not over. If you're naming the top 5 most clutch quarterbacks of all time, John Elway's name is brought up right up there with Tom Brady. It was so much fun to watch him play. And I would just ask people not to just go to his Pro Football Reference page and be like, what? He only had a 70-something quarterback rating. Football is different. And I actually looked at this from like 94 to 98. He was like top 5 in quarterback rating as the league was changing, and it was becoming easier to throw the football. Number 1 is very hard. I thought about going with an offensive lineman just because we have spent so much time in our lives talking about offensive linemen on the show. I thought it might be right to pick like Tom Nalen or something for the Broncos. But I went with a little bit off of the beaten trail here. But another guy who I just really loved how he played the game, one of the most explosive, exciting, fun cornerbacks of all time, and one of the great trades in history, was the Denver Broncos acquiring Champ Bailey. I mean, they're like, outside of Deion Sanders, how many corners can you name ever that you were like watching for them? I can't wait to see this guy play. Champ Bailey was one of them. So he ends up as my favorite Denver Bronco ever in my extremely chalk list that includes a kicker. So your reaction, man.
I love it. Champ Bailey was just amazing, man. And he was a guy that, at the University of Georgia was a kind of a two-way player too. He gets forgotten about a little bit, because Charles Woodson was playing at the same time at Michigan, and he was kind of viewed as a two-way player, would play some wide receiver a little bit, but Champ Bailey did a little bit of that at Georgia too. And Champ Bailey, the play I always remember is the pick 6 against Brady in the playoffs, where the Patriots are down inside the 5-yard line, and Champ Bailey houses it 99 yards in that division. I think it was that divisional game in 2005, and that was an interesting time too, because the Patriots were coming off of winning 3 titles in 4 years, and so that was kind of a play that signaled the end of that first Patriots dynasty of all those Super Bowl championships. So yeah, Champ Bailey was great. John Elway, man, if like you said, you can't go and look at the numbers, the Pro Football Reference numbers, particularly like in the 90s, the early to mid 90s. If you look at how good he was just in the last couple of years of his career, I mean, the guy was retired at 38, 39 years old, and he was at the top of his game. He was one of the best quarterbacks in the league in 1998 and just absolutely obliterated the Atlanta Falcons in that Super Bowl, which ended up being his curtain call. John Elway was just the physical tools, the ability to, to move around in the pocket, and just had a rocket of an arm, and just tough too. I mean, he withstood a lot of physical punishment in the late 80s and the early 90s, when even with those Broncos teams that were going to the Super Bowl in the late 80s that were pretty good, he got beat up a lot in those Super Bowls, man, and he hung in there and ended up still having a great career, and just one of the all-time greatest. And like I said, very proud that I was able to be there in Canton for his Hall of Fame enshrinement, him and Barry Sanders. It was great.
Except you put a nose tackle on your top 5 over John Elway. So, all right, before we wrap up, I want to give my prize picks. And if you remember, prizepicks.com is a sponsor of the show. We always take a look at those prize picks where we pick more or less on player yardage totals and other things, sometimes including touchdowns or field goals. And if you go to prizepicks.com/purple, use the code purple, first deposit match up to $100. So tell me, Manny, if you agree or disagree with my prize picks for this week. I am going with more than 232.5 yards for Josh Dobbs passing. Would you agree or disagree with more than 232? Oh, no, I'm actually sorry. I went with less than 232.5 yards. Would you agree with fewer than 232 yards passing for Josh Dobbs?
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's going to be less than that, and I don't think it means that he's not going to be productive, because obviously he can be very productive with his legs as well. So, yeah, I think it'll be less than that.
More, I went with Russell Wilson, more than 206.5 yards passing. I know that I ran through Russell Wilson and how rare it's been to go over 200 yards. I think Denver will have to play from behind, though, and they'll have to play a little catch up, and they will struggle to run the football and will have to pass. So Wilson goes over 206.5.
I will say, yep, I agree with that. He'll go over, but not that much over, probably around like 220.
All right. So we'll agree on both of those, more than 206.5. And with TJ Hawkinson, I went with more than 56.5. Now, I am being asked to add a kicker. So I'm going to add a kicker in a second. More or less than 56.5 for TJ Hawkinson. I think he just keeps rolling here, especially if Jefferson is not back.
Yeah, I think Josh Dobbs has really kind of found him as a really reliable, sort of safety blanket, as he did last week against New Orleans. I think 56.5. Yeah, I think Hawkinson will go more than that.
Okay. Upon request, I will add Greg Joseph, more or less points than 6.5 for Greg Joseph. That's very hard. That means that means either a field goal and 4 extra points, or 2 field goals and an extra point. I don't know. More or less 6.5 points for the kicker. It's a really good line.
I'll say more. I'll say more, because he'll probably kick a couple of field goals, and then the Vikings will find themselves in the end zone, I think, at some point in the game. So I'll say more.
I will also go more. And here's the crazy thing about Prize Picks. The entry for this, the entry fee, $20 to win 200 if I get all of them. And we've done okay. We've had fun with that throughout the year. Prizepicks.com/purple. Manny, great stuff as always. Tremendous Denver Broncos list and discussion. And get well soon to Lamar Jackson and Joe Burrow, because the football carnage of quarterbacks this year has been freaking outrageous. And I hope it does not continue. So thanks to you. Thanks to everybody who watched. Remember, because I completely blew it with the audio from the roundtable, I will be live on YouTube on Friday night previewing the Vikings Broncos and taking all of your questions. We'll do it fans only style. We haven't done that in a little while. So I will do entirely just chatting with everybody then. Make sure you join, and we will catch you next